And we're back. We're live with History Unsettled. Whoops, stop that. Go ahead, introduce yourselves while I fix this.
Hi, I'm Dr. Misha Griffith. I'm a community college professor of history, and this is my partner
and technical savant.
Jerry Griffith, award-winning documentary filmmaker.
For what it's worth. Now, we're here tonight. We're going to talk to you a little bit about an upcoming show. This is kind of a history hangout, which is a technical way of saying we haven't prepared as much as we would like to have.
if only because what we've got coming up next week is so big and so special that I haven't had a chance to get to the Library of Congress yet to pick up images and stuff.
So we're going to talk about a topic that's interesting, inspiring, controversial. It's a controversy that started about 125 years ago, has not ended yet, probably won't end in your lifetime.
Something that's really close to Jerry and my heart.
Yes. And now we're teasing. We should tell them. What are you going to talk about? You know, what it's like. So what are we going to talk about? What are we going to talk about, Doctor?
We're going to be talking about the birth of environmentalism in the United States. It didn't start in 1970 with the first Earth Day, and it certainly didn't start with the great big blue marble, although the image of the blue marble and Earth Day were hallmarks. It didn't start with Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring,
which changed some attitudes. But the environmental movement, the conservation movement, was going for at least 70 years before that.
With the founding of
the Sierra Club
and the Department of Interior and the Forest Service.
U.S. Forest Service. Department of Interior was actually older. It
existed long before. It was there, yeah.
The Forest Service was founded in 1905. The Sierra Club was founded around 1896.
Yeah.
Give or take a little bit. But these were methods of dealing with a very real problem that existed in our society. And that is...
It was a huge problem. And that was logging. Theodore Roosevelt said that your typical American only saw value in a tree if it was cut down. And this was a problem because people were cutting down trees and cutting down trees and cutting down trees.
Okay, but in America, when America was established from the beginning, it had it's a resource. Look, I mean, a ridge, there's another ridge, there's more trees. Oh, a valley, there's a town. Town wasn't there back then, but still. So there was this psychology that said, we can just chop more.
Right. The seemingly endless expanse of frontier and trees encouraged people to actually abuse it. But when we get into the 1890s, something happens. Basically, one of the most important things that happens is that Americans realize, oh, we don't have an endless frontier, that it stops.
There's an ocean at the other end.
There's an ocean at the other end. And all of a sudden, it's no longer an endless frontier. It's our country.
There's something else that also happens, which is throughout the 19th century, this is a picture from Minnesota. Now, again, it's a low res. Sorry, I'm going to cut off of that because it's so bad. Big trees, Minnesota, logging. Today, there aren't a lot of trees in Minnesota.
Nope. Minnesota is mainly grassland because of
logging, deforestation.
Deforestation and forest fires.
Well, forest fires are natural. We've always had forest fires, haven't we?
Yeah, no question. We've always had forest fires. We've had forest fires since we've had trees.
Okay.
But there is the science of forestry that tells us that basically, from the evidence we know, forest is a fire is a natural part of a forest.
Well, some fire. Obviously, bears don't build campfires.
Right.
Raccoons don't smoke in the woods.
No.
At least they shouldn't.
But we do have lightning strikes.
We have lightning strikes.
We do have volcanic eruptions.
Okay, so what percentage of fires are caused by natural versus man-made? Do you know?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Do you know off the top of your head?
That's something we're going to have to look it up and talk about next week because I just got caught.
Yep.
Okay. So what happens is in the 1880s, we start to see people running out of timber, running out of woods. And there's an interesting gentleman who I don't have a picture of by the name of George Vanderbilt.
Aha. Yes.
George Vanderbilt was in some ways responsible for modern forest management.
Right.
George Vanderbilt was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad baron.
Right.
He decided to build himself a big house in
South Carolina?
North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Yes.
Okay. And it had a very a considerable amount of forest around it. And he wanted to take care of that forest, mainly because he was living there. It was an aesthetic idea of his to have a pretty forest.
He didn't like things that looked like this.
Yes, that was not, he didn't feel that that was a proper thing for a rich man like himself to
And
have.
this was
in his
going on
yard.
in much of the country. This is clear cutting. And there's two types of clear cutting, of course. There's clear cutting, which is done for the purpose of, because it's the only way to get certain types of trees that need fresh sunlight. And there's other type of clear cutting that is done because it's cheap.
Because it's cheaper, and you leave behind the rubble and the trees you don't want, and you take whatever trees you do want.
So back to Cornelius Vanderbilt, didn't want this, but he decided to create a model forest around the property of Biltmore in North Carolina.
Right.
And so he decided to hire
America's first forester, a gentleman by the name of Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was from a very wealthy family, and as he was going off to college at Yale, his father said, "Why don't you become a forester?" Now,
not what my father said when I went away to college. He said,
the Pinchot,
"You'll never get a job with that."
Yeah, the Pinchot family had traveled extensively in Europe, and they had traveled all over America, doing a lot of camping. Pinchot especially liked trout fishing, and just being out in the wilderness, which, of course, there was a lot of back at that time. And so he thought very carefully about what his father said and wanted to become a forester. He thought that was a very interesting career path, except for the fact that there were no forestry schools in America, period.
Because America forestry was done like this.
Right. So he...
And like this. Oh, that's John
No,
Muir.
that's
Sorry,
John
we're
Muir.
getting to John Muir later.
Yeah, we'll get into him later. But he decided that he was going to learn forestry, which meant that while he was an undergraduate at Yale, he took a lot of science classes, a lot of biology classes, and botany classes, so that he would have a general grounding of the science. But he had to go to Europe, namely France, in order to study the science of forestry. It was a good thing his family could speak French, his entire family could speak French fluently, and they could speak German very well. And so he went on to do further study in France and then in Switzerland.
Now, you are a historian, but you also worked at one time for forest management as a seasonal firefighter.
I worked my way through college the first time as a seasonal firefighter.
So I want to ask you, when you say scientific forestry,
right.
Now, what does that mean? It seems to me, if I just leave the forest alone, it's going to grow back. It may take a little while. It's going to be fine. Why do we need scientific forestry? What is that? Science?
Yeah. The idea of scientific forestry is, how do you best manage a forest? You could manage a forest to be left alone, to never have anyone in it, to let nature take its course. There are forests like that in the world. A couple that come to mind are in the DMZ in Korea, between North and South Korea. There is literally a completely unmanaged forest there. Around Chernobyl, another completely unmanaged forest, because no one is going to take out the radioactive trees. So those are two examples of forests that will probably, for a foreseeable time, be completely untouched. Every other forest, though, has to be managed in some way, even if you're talking about wilderness, even if you're talking about the least impacted type of forest that you can get. You still need roads, you still need development of campsites, you still need development of trails. And so even at a minimal effort, you're going to make an impact on the forest, and you're going to figure out how you want it to be managed. And forestry science is about management. You can manage it for aesthetics, like a wilderness. You can manage it for recreation, like our national park system, in which people can go in and out. And so you need a huge number of facilities for people in that system. But we have our national forests, which are managed by the U.S. Forest Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture.
Agriculture? Wait.
Yep.
Like trees? Like you mean plants, the cotton seeds?
Right.
Why is No, by the way, I know this, but
That was, yeah,
this
that-
is sound awfully controversial. If it's in the Department of Agriculture, it's about making money,
right.
as opposed to preserving this vital, precious, inspiring natural resource.
Right, exactly. There was a strict division between the Department of the Interior and how they handled their forests, and the Department of Agriculture and how they handled their forests. Because once Gifford Pinchot came back with this knowledge of forestry and started applying it for Vanderbilt, and then became a consulting forester, the United States' first consulting forester.
My card.
He understood that if you wanted to keep the trees, you had to make them valuable. And the only way to make them valuable at the time was to make them a resource that could be cut down and used.
So harvesting. So he's basically saying his model was preserve the forests by showing how you make money off of them.
Right. His motto.
There's no, depending on the kindness of strangers, take care of it because it's the right thing to do. It's take care of the forest because you'll make more money at it.
Exactly. His concept, his basic concept was the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time.
Sounds like Marx.
That's why
he was a Republican, wasn't he?
Pinchot was a very strong Republican, but he was part of the progressive Republican movement, not the other type of movement. So that's really enough of Gifford Pinchot for right now.
Well,
we want to tease the audience more than
First off, there's the progressive political movement. Now, the word is around today, but they're mostly Democrats, whereas at the turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century, they were mostly Republicans.
Right.
But essentially, progressives were people that believed we can make a better world.
Right.
We can solve these problems. We can solve crime. We can solve poverty. We can do all of these things. We can create a better world, as opposed to the naturalists, the preservationists, or the pillagers who basically said, give me my money now.
Right. So we've really got three schools of thought here. We've got the pillagers. We've got the guys who are in it for profit, not in it for the long haul, taking the trees, destroying nature, and making a quick buck off of it. That's the one primary group that held sway at the end of the 19th century. Then there's Gifford Pinchot and his progressive Republicans who were looking to conserve the forests, not preserve, conserve. He started using that word.
Pinchot claims to have invented the word conservation.
I'm not
sure if he did, because Pinchot had an ego. He really did. He thought he was going to run for president. One time he came close, but and that's way too much detail for here. He offended President Taft. He sided with Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, which led to a Democratic, and basically ended his political career.
Pinchot in his writings described conservation as this. Conservation means the wise use of the earth and its resources for the lasting good of men. Conservation is the foresighted utilization, preservation, and/or renewal of forests, waters, lands, and minerals for the greatest good of the greatest number for the longest time.
Actually, longest time is a key word here. Right. That's something that's missed. When we talk about people today exploiting the environment for financial gain, often they're not looking at the longer time.
Nope.
But there was another movement that we're going to talk about, which actually started a little bit before this. And this grew out of people who basically said, this is the 19th century. Our cities are wretched. They smell bad. They're polluted. They're crowded.
Well, this is clearly a 20th century picture, but you kind of get the idea.
Give me a break. It was free. Okay. The cities at the end of the 19th century, and honestly, the cities for much of time were a mess. In the late 19th century, of course, at the tenements, you had 15 people sleeping to a room.
Right. You had the Industrial Revolution.
You had smokestacks and pollution.
Right. Because everyone had to cook and heat their homes with coal or with wood, which meant cutting down more trees. But if you're in an urban environment, coal was much easier to get. It's much easier to ship, etc.
And we had the naturalist movement starting at this time with people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who spent a year living in a cabin in the woods.
Right. And this movement essentially grew out of Romanticism. This idea that nature can be a way for men to learn or people to learn how to be better.
And part of this was the philosophy that several people had. I keep going back to the beginning of this clip. I want to play forward. Anyway, oops, there it is. Sorry. That the idea was that going out in the woods was refreshing, rejuvenating for the soul. It's important for people to be able to go out in the woods. And this was the creation of the Preservationist movement. People mess things up. Let's keep things pristine and perfect.
Right.
And of course, their big advocate was Mr. John Muir. John Muir was, he wasn't always old, although most of the pictures show him that way. John Muir was, of course, from Scotland. He grew up in a very, very strict puritanical Protestant family. First in Scotland, they moved to Wisconsin when he was 10, went to the University of Wisconsin, studied a bunch of things, could not fit in, dropped in. I mentioned here on the slide, he's spiritual, but not religious. He tended to, again,
wax poetical.
Oh, he waxed poetical. And we'll talk about that in a second. But in his early life, he was extremely religious, and many of his writings are very Christian influenced. His later stuff is much more the trees are my church, the forest is my congregation. In fact, at one point when they talked about damming Hetchy Reservoir, he said, why don't you just dam up a cathedral instead?
Yeah, why not just fill a cathedral full of water?
Okay.
And this is interesting, and we'll get into this next week, that both Pinchot and Muir used religious terminology. Pinchot, the idea of the Church of Conservation, and Pinchot, and Muir, the idea of the forest as a
renewing,
salvation,
rejuvenating, salvation. He saw a lot of parallels with religious imagery. But I want to share with you just so you heard some of what Pinchot wrote, which is very clinical. He's very educated, very proper. Many of his things that are written for other people in mainstream press tended to be a lot of arguments. They're saying, well, that's just like if you were a farmer and you ran out of seeds and so you planted grapefruit or something. He talks in a lot of these homilies, but they're very precise, very edited. Here's a little bit of a section from a book called My First Summer in the Sierra by John Muir. A glorious wilderness that seemed to be calling with 1,000 songful voices, bold, down-sweeping slopes feathered with pines and clumps of manzanita, with sunny open spaces between them, make up most of the foreground. The middle and the background present fold beyond fold of finely modeled hills and ridges, rising into mountain-like masses in the distance, all covered with a shaggy growth of chaparral, planted so marvelously close and even that it looks like a soft, rich plush without a single tree or bare spot. As far as the eye can reach, it extends, a heaving, swelling sea of green, as regular and continuous as that produced by the heaths of Scotland. Wow.
Yeah, he's a good writer.
He's a good writer, but it's also a visual writing. And I don't know about you, but when I hear that, I see it.
He will also, when talking about the plants, he's very keen on identifying all the plants.
He studied botany quite a bit.
He studied botany, although he dropped out of college. And so when you get into his books and read it, he's going to say what the plant is, the common usage of the name, and then he's going to use the Latin usage, which makes it, really easy for those of us who are reading 150 years later, who might not be sitting in the Sierra Nevada, to understand exactly what he's talking about.
So Muir's basic pitch was preserve the forest because we need it, because it rejuvenates. Now, I haven't been in a forest since Sunday.
Right.
And I got to tell you, it is a marvelous experience.
Mm-hmm.
It really works on me. I think he's right. The problem is, of course, that America today is a country of 300 million people.
We can't all go in the forest at the same time.
No, somebody's got to clean up after us.
Right.
So, but Pinchot was taking the attitude of money and conservation, preserve it. Now,
well, Pinchot's idea was not that he wanted to see everybody make money. He wanted to keep the forests. See, this is what's really interesting about this argument, is that Muir and Pinchot are not that far off in conservation versus preservation, because they both had the same enemy, the guy who was going out and cutting down trees. They
did. They were friends for a time.
They knew each other. They wrote back and forth.
And then Pinchot said, we should allow grazing on federal lands.
Right.
And Muir said, you are dead to me.
Yes. Yeah. Muir.
And he never spoke with him again publicly. They did publish articles in the same newspaper. They would publish articles against each other. It's basically slow motion dueling by article.
Yeah, and it was very, people were very interested in what was going on because they wanted to see who was going to win. I mean, it became a horse race,
But
after all.
this guy right here in the picture on the, let's see, that would be the right-hand side of the screen with the big hat. He was kind of the prize. Both Muir and Pinchot sought after him. That's Theodore Roosevelt.
Yep.
Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive Republican. He was born wealthy. He lived wealthy. He died wealthy.
Yes.
He believed that it was the responsibility of the wealthy to make a better world for everybody.
Right. That was part of his Protestant
He
message.
was very pro-business, but business had to be regulated and controlled.
Right.
The forest had to be regulated and controlled. And while there are any number of pictures of Muir and Roosevelt together, while Roosevelt camped with him in Yosemite, and I got more pictures, they're cool pictures.
Yeah.
It was Pinchot that got his ear.
Right. Well, Pinchot, John Muir was still out in the forest, while Pinchot was, of course, the head of the U.S. Forest Service while Theodore Roosevelt was president. And as head of the U.S. Forest Service, he created the policy. I mean, really, he created the policy of what the Forest Service would do.
Let's look at a short video.
Okay, let's look at a short video.
When Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt established the National Forest Service,
You're not switched
they
into
created
it.
a scientifically
Your mic is
managed
live.
method of keeping track of what's out here.
We're going to recue that because we can
maintaining
do
it
that.
Not only as a beautiful and Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt established the National Forest Service, they created a scientifically managed method of keeping track of what's out here, maintaining it not only as a beautiful environment, but also as an agricultural and an economic resource. This has led to the management of an area larger than France and the island of Great Britain combined. And when it works, it's absolutely beautiful. This is what it looks like when it works.
And this is what happens when it's not. We're standing here in the middle of the Carr Fire. This burned in July and August of 2018. It burned approximately 230,000 acres. It destroyed 1,000 homes. They had to evacuate tens of thousands of people because it burned in a national recreation area, a national forest, and also throughout some small towns in the region. They lost about 1,000 structures, and 8 people died in the fire. 5 civilians trying to escape were burned up in their homes, and 3 firefighters were killed fighting this fire. They put everything on it they could. The 747 bomber, helicopters, myriads of fire trucks, thousands of firefighters, and they could not stop.
We're back now. Okay. Little technical issues there. Okay. So that's the story that we wanted to talk about, forest management.
Mm-hmm. Basically, we were back in California this weekend, and we were able to pick up some video in the forest. We were able to get around in the burned out areas and see what was happening there. We talked to some docents at Whiskeytown recreational area, and we got some ideas about what is happening there.
So if you look at this is more, now there was a snowstorm going, which is kind of cool, but you can see that when the fire burns through, it doesn't wipe out everything. It pretty much like kills most, but not all of the trees. And it kills most of the trees, but it leaves them. It leaves them behind. But you see the duff, the undergrowth is all gone. And this tends to leave, well,
what?
This leads to erosion. This leads to other problems, of
Yeah,
course.
this is the big problem now. Now that the fire has been put out, and obviously they got a foot of snow yesterday. So the fire's out officially. But these lack of trees and the trees having burned down, sometimes below the soil level and into the root system, the problem you've got now is erosion. If you look around some of these shots, you will see little growths. Those are growths of trees and bushes naturally coming back. This is only 6 months after the fire.
Well, so the forest is going to survive, but yet most of these trees you're seeing here are dead.
Right.
And
most of them are oak, which are certainly the ones that are still standing are oak. They in the West Coast, these kind of oak don't have much of a commercial value. A lot of the timber is going to be cut is mainly the pine and the fir and the cedar. They might be a little bit singed, but they still have some value. We saw logging trucks with pitch black logs all over the place driving around.
So let me ask you, can forest management prevent this?
Not this fire. Forest management.
Well, this was started by a car.
This was started by a car. The trailer got a flat tire, and before the people could pull over, the hub of the tire threw out sparks in the grass, and boom, it was gone. It was a perfect situation because California had been going through its drought, and it just lit the undergrowth and the grass, and there was no stopping it. This fire jumped highways. This fire jumped rivers. This fire jumped part of a lake. There's footage of boats in the middle of the lake that had been burned to the water line. And fiberglass, which shouldn't burn, had burned and melted to the water line.
So the intellectual question is, if the Forest Service can't prevent that kind of destruction, why are we spending $5 billion a year, which we are, on the Forest Service? The Forest Service has twice the budget of the National Park Service.
Right.
They manage, as I said in the video, an area the size of Great Britain and France combined, and yet they can't prevent the forest from burning down. Now, this is outside of Redding, up in Paradise, California, where the town was at the top of the hill instead of at the bottom.
The campfire this October.
Burned through and took out a huge amount of houses and property. Whereas
thousands of houses.
Actually, here you can actually drive down the highway and you can see where they managed to stop it right at the edge of town. It was kind of dramatic.
Yeah, there's some very dramatic places, and there are people who had put a defensible barrier around their house. That basically, for California, people know what I'm talking about, cutting down all the brush within a certain range of your house. You can see houses that survived because they had done exactly that. You can see there is a mausoleum and an old Catholic cemetery that, of course, had been all planted in lovely green grass. It looks great, but it is surrounded 360 degrees with dead, burned trees.
Unintentional cremations.
Yeah. Ooh.
So, hey, this is a tasteless show. I can't help
it. It is tasteless.
We do that. But so there's still the question of you can't stop this devastation.
No.
So then why are we spending $5 billion a year? Are you telling me it would be worse? I mean, it could be worse is kind of like,
number one, because the land is not just one type of land. It is railroads and highways that are leading to towns and cities, that are leading to water reservoirs that people need for drinking water and irrigation. You've got national parks, national forests, state parks, state forests. People who just wanted to get away from it all have bought their cabin out in the woods, and then now it's gone. In Paradise at the campfire, many of the people who died were out of cell phone range, could not be reached, and the sheriff could not get to them down their long, windy roads to tell them, get out. So many people died just in exactly that way. Also, the town of Paradise, because it only had one highway going through the center of it, there weren't enough escape routes.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you in short is we can't prevent this, but possibly we can prevent this. Not this, this. Some destruction is going to happen, or this. This is, of course, just senseless, lazy, cheap clear cutting.
Right.
One of the things that Gifford Pinchot talked about, and there's an article which I wanted to share, which maybe, again, we're going to be doing more of this next week.
Right.
Pinchot talks about how before there was a Forest Service, there was no method of controlling, and so people would go in and they just chop down trees.
Yeah, there were 11 guys in an office in Washington, D.C. That's not good forestry management.
Today there's 7,000, I believe, and
still
again, they got a budget
enough.
of 5 billion people.
Yeah, still not enough.
$5 billion. $5 billion. Okay, but So we have this movement, though, that's going on at this time called technocracy.
Right.
Technocracy is, again, part of the progressives. There's a belief that technology and science can solve all our problems. And for the records, it solved a lot.
Yes. We've got
vaccines, electricity.
exactly.
Our
And it's-
air
right.
today is less polluted than it was.
Right. And it's this second industrial revolution that kicks in after 1850, in which we see this idea that we could build a better world. The social questions are now up for examination, and how do we fix it?
Okay. These are magazines, by the way, from the 1930s, because that's what I could find. But
Right.
technocracy was still going. There was still basically the belief in technocracy as a philosophy that technology and science are going to build a brave new world. It was kind of related to progressivism, which was earlier, that basically involved social programs.
Right.
Because before this, you had all of these social programs, crime, poverty. It was basically like,
Oh, you had-
take care of itself. It'll be okay. The progressives were saying we can fix this just like
Yeah.
we can fix the Forest Service.
Right. You still had in places like London and New York, you still had cholera outbreaks. You still had tuberculosis. You had typhus. These are the diseases that we don't see nowadays, or that we can fix, like tuberculosis. But they were running rampant in the population.
Now here's a picture. This is actually for a cartoon from Puck magazine. This is Columbia talking to Uncle Sam, and they're looking out across the American prairies, and there's nothing but, you kind of see under these the denuded forest, fallen trees. And what Columbia is telling Uncle Sam is, get rid of your tariff on timber so that we can import foreign timber. But that is another problem, because our forests are being denuded and cleaned out. But this is one of the solutions we've had, and I'm not sure it's a solution that says, we'll stop logging so much, we'll just import all of our timber.
Right.
Well, isn't that going to denude another country?
Yeah, that means that you've got rainforests in the Amazon, you've got the Philippines, you've got Indonesian islands, you've got Southeast Asia and Canada. And of course, eventually we're going to see Russia get into the game too.
We think.
Yeah, at
It
some
seems
point.
likely. It's still pretty expensive to bring wood all the way from Russia.
Right.
But, there's this question of how much can you do? Do we really need wood at all? I mean,
Mhm.
other than the fact that, it's kind of useful.
Right.
But,
But we can grow things to make paper out of hemp, of course. Yeah, there are alternatives.
you can build your house out of bricks.
Our house is made out of bricks, but you don't make the floors out of bricks. You make the floors out of wood and some gypsum. You make stairs, generally speaking, out of wood. There's elements inside the house that are out of wood because it's easier to work with. You don't have to have the kind of specialization that you need for a bricklayer.
Okay. This is something slightly related that is actually not included in forest management, but in many ways, this was a big trigger. This is passenger pigeons.
Mhm.
And the passenger pigeon became extinct, of course, and people said, it was the first really devastating thing because
Right.
passenger pigeons traveled in flocks of millions.
And they were hunted.
They were hunted, but but people thought they would go on forever.
Right.
And of course, passenger pigeon is a species which does not, it can't function in small groups. It's like an ant. You can't have 3 ants.
Yeah, it needed
can't have three.
needed to have
You
a
needed
large
a
group.
huge colony, and once the colony hit below a critical threshold, they just
They're gone.
expired. Last
gone.
passenger pigeon in the wild died in the 1890s. Last one in
Right.
captivity. It wasn't until the 1920s, actually.
Wow.
But this was an indicator species. This was a real wake-up call to people.
So this is part of the problem of good forestry management, is the idea that you're not just dealing with trees. If you're dealing with trees, it's very easy, but you're dealing with different generations of trees, different types of trees, different climates, and of course with climate change, that's changing what's going to grow in a forest. But you've also got to consider wildlife that's in the forest. You've got to consider minerals that are there in the forest, that there are very big benefits for people still who want to go out and mine. There's plenty of ways that people can just, fill out a couple of forms, get out there with their gold pan and dig and pan for gold. And you've got water. Water is something, especially fresh water, something we're going to be fighting over for a very long time. This summer, was it this summer? It was this summer or sometime this year that South Africa ran out of water.
Yes, South Africa last summer. Okay.
Very famously, just ran out of water.
Pretoria. Okay, so we do still have today this struggle between the preservationist
and the conservation. There's a glass of water over there.
The preservationist who says preserve nature at all costs, and the capitalist basically who says find a way to make it pay for itself. If we do continue this next week, we can talk about how they really came to a head over Hetchy Reservoir, which is a section of Yosemite where, this was a true philosophical question, because Yosemite Valley is beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places
Absolutely.
on the planet.
Mhm.
Okay. San Francisco had a fire.
Right.
They had an earthquake and a fire in 1906.
Right.
They ran out of water.
Yeah.
They ran out of fresh water. People died in great
because they
quantities.
didn't have enough water.
Theodore Roosevelt said, we need to find a stable supply of drinking water for San Francisco.
Right.
Gifford, what do you think? And he said, we brought in some engineers, and the best way we can provide water to San Francisco is to dam up this portion of Yosemite Valley called Hetchy, and it's straight downhill. It's 140 miles, which seems like farther, but anyway, runs straight down into the city of San Francisco. This will provide San Francisco with mountain drinking water. It'll be a fresh, reliable source.
Right. But it meant giving up a whole valley.
And John Muir said, are you out of your freaking mind?
Yep. Yeah, this is.
You're destroying my church.
Yeah, this was how.
And Gifford Pinchot said, the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. And this is a question. Okay,
sure.
I'm not sure that the greatest good for the greatest number always works. Sometimes you have to say, but this is special.
Yeah.
Maybe we can inconvenience you a little bit more by bringing water from Folsom or someplace out there. It's going to be more expensive, but you destroyed one of the most beautiful places on earth. This is the balance of people versus the environment. And to this day, the Sierra Club still says, tear down Hetchy. Yes, it'll take 100 years for the valley to grow back, but it will come back. Owens Valley in Eastern California was called the Switzerland of California. Today, it's one of the most desolate places you can go.
Because it was drained via aqueduct for Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles.
Which
drank all the water.
If you saw Chinatown,
city of Los Angeles took the Colorado River. The amount of water that makes it through down to the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of Baja.
Gulf of California, yes.
Yeah, Gulf of California, yeah, thank you.
But if you have the greatest good for the greatest number
minimal.
for the longest time, then you should plug it up.
Right.
You should drain it. Nobody lives in that part of Arizona, or they didn't then. Very few people.
Yeah.
So where do you come down?
Where do you stop? Where do you? Yeah.
I was hoping you had an answer.
I wish I did.
You have an answer?
Yeah. I mean, my idea for California is to basically desalination, which takes a huge amount of energy, but you're also talking about a very sunny state.
Okay, well.
And also there are loopholes in the water and in the water rights
enough
industry.
Water to supply San Francisco and environs, which is 5 million people in the whole area. It's 700,000 in San Francisco itself.
Yeah.
That's a lot of desalination.
Yeah,
we do not have
huge
that
amount.
technology doesn't exist today.
No, not in that quantity. However, there is plenty of fresh water supplies in California. But we keep draining the aquifer.
So, but do you have a position? Do you say nature, preservation, conservation? But conservation leads to saying, we'll conserve this, but not that. Yeah. We don't make money on this. Should we conserve aspen forests because we don't make money on them, but we make money on pine forests?
Right.
This is then what are you doing to our planet? There are people, other than a little national park, are people going to have a chance to walk through an aspen forest, which are very prevalent in the West.
Right.
But we don't make money on them. We make money on pine trees.
Right.
And fir.
And, are people willing to wait until the trees that you need grow up? And
well,
that's
with
part of
sustained yield,
yeah.
you can. Sustained yield, which grew out of this time, basically says you take them out at the same rate you plant them. You have these charts. And scientific forestry is amazingly complex.
Yes.
It involves geology, hydrology, botany, even how much sun gets through. So, they're doing this. Sustained yield you can do.
Right.
But if you're going to be the greatest good for the greatest number, if you're going to drive it based on economics, then you're going to say, let's clear out all of these different species and only plant Douglas fir in here, and we'll just go through, and we have no diversity. Our wildlife, which needs diversity, which needs different things, the whole system works, nature works on diversity, and so one disease goes through, it doesn't wipe everything out.
Right. And a Douglas fir forest is easy to plant and grow, and it's a very marketable tree, but Douglas fir is very nitrogen hungry. It needs to have nitrogen in the soil. If you do not fix nitrogen in the soil sufficiently for these trees, then they're not going to grow very well. They're going to grow more slowly. So scientifically, you know that you have to plant or allow to grow in that area a primary generation of trees. That's aspen or alder, which are not commercially interesting
You can
trees
get a little paper
for
out
the
of them,
most
not
part.
much,
Yeah, and alder fixes nitrogen in the soil. It doesn't use it. It puts it in little nodules in the roots, and then when the alder is gone, then the Douglas fir can grow and grow much faster. But you have to wait. You have to be willing to wait for that generation. And people who want to make money don't want to wait for that generation. That was part of Gifford Pinchot's genius, was that if you have a forest service and you sell the capability of people going in and foresting it, and you regulate them, you tell them what they can cut and where they can cut it, and they pay a fee, and then that fee goes back to regenerating the forest.
We have a comment from somebody in live chat about the comment about, I assume that's about Hetchy. Couldn't imagine that going over well in today's society. And that's right.
Right.
So the philosophy of Gifford Pinchot has not triumphed.
No,
we still have them both interwoven. And unfortunately, we're making a lot of decisions based on emotion.
Yeah, the story of the Klamath River Dam in far northern California is very important. That was a dam that had been put in, I believe, for some hydroelectric. It didn't produce a lot, but what it did do was ruin fisheries, especially for the Native Americans who lived there. The salmon could not get upstream, and they fought for, and the Sierra Club fought for it as well, and won the opportunity to take the dam out.
Okay, but
so
what do you have
salmon
for your power?
Came back.
We still have power. Okay, we're in Virginia now, and we don't have hydroelectric power. Nope. My backlight right here is powered by coal. We're burning coal. We are polluting the environment.
Right, now, and natural gas.
All right, but natural gas is pretty good. But still, the point is, the trade-off, this big picture, and when voters get involved, they tend to react very emotionally. You need to save my forestry job. You need to save this beautiful park. But what about this park? But what about this area over here? And this big picture. But one of the things with conservation is we don't see trees like this anymore. This is part of what farmers or loggers found on the West Coast in the 1880s and 90s. Now, if you go to the Redwood Park, there's places where you can drive through a tree. We've all done it. It's like, oh, I drove through a tree. It's really cool. But this level of majesty, and there's a few left, I should qualify that. There are a few left that are kept, but they're kept as museum pieces. Look, it's an example. Oh, look, that's very nice. If you've seen one redwood, you've seen them all. No, that's not true.
Yeah.
A redwood forest is a beautiful thing. And who are we to say, oh, we know well enough that we're going to go in and we know what works best for the forest. This is the hubris of Gifford Pinchot and his managed forestry is we know how to run a forest better than nature does.
But at the same time, if we start understanding these complex forests and how they're tied into everything else that's happening in the area around it. Watersheds had been overlooked for quite some time, and Pinchot really emphasized how important it was to have those watersheds and have them working. So where many other people saw a swamp and land that no one wanted to use or wanted to fill it in, that land, that watery, wet land, supports certain wildlife that cannot be supported anywhere else, like sandhill cranes,
Okay.
and various species of goose, or migratory geese and ducks and all that. But it takes setting aside this area now, because I think of the growth of cameras, and people are using these cameras more and going out and enjoying taking pictures, and we're seeing cameras with bigger and better zooms. You've got this level of photography tourism going to these wildlife areas, going to these wetlands.
But even there's too many. We're not at Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir on horseback. There's millions of people who go out in the woods all the time, including me.
Yeah, and we're loving some of these areas to death. There's areas
where that picture was taken today. There's a paved road. There's and there's 5 million visitors a year.
Right.
In Yosemite Park.
How do you handle 5 million visitors a year?
That's a lot of toilet paper.
That's a lot of toilet paper. And guess where we get toilet paper?
From trees. All right. So have we resolved anything? I don't think we have.
Oh, you want us to resolve something?
Well, we're supposed to be discussing the issue and which is the better solution, conservation versus preservation. And of course, you carry them to extremes. This is really what it comes down to, is you carry preservation to an extreme, then none of us go into the forest.
Right.
Basically, it's walled off, like the demilitarized zone in North Korea. That's true preservation. And nature abides, nature takes care of itself, but there's 7 billion people on this planet.
Yeah.
As opposed to conservation in the Gifford Pinchot sense, in the true sense of it, you would be finding ways for the greatest good, for the greatest number, for the longest time. That's economic.
Right.
And you're going to be saying, you're not going to clear cut the Midwest the way they did. That devastation is done, but you are going to be just hauling up and planting row after row of Douglas fir, and you're going to be damming up Yosemite Valley, because Yosemite Valley would also make a tremendous hydro reserve. It really would, just all that water back up.
Well, we got a question. Puffalopagus wants to know, how do you convince a society to grow trees they will never bask in the shade of? Very poetic.
Do you have kids?
Anyway, yeah, that's part of the controversy, and this was the controversy back then, 130 years ago.
Well, some of this, and again, this gets almost back to the Gordon Gekko school of philosophy.
Right.
I do what's best for me and it's best for everybody. Well, no. Greed is not good.
Greed is not good.
Not in and of itself. Managed greed can accomplish great things.
Right.
But it's got to be managed. This is part of what Roosevelt did, was he established regulations and rules on the Forest Service, on what could be cut and what couldn't. And then you didn't go there, but I'm going to say something. They've screwed up a lot.
Yeah.
Over the last 120 years, 115 years of the National Forest Service, they have made a huge amount of mistakes.
Right. They went in. Well, we'll talk about this next week. But as soon as Roosevelt decided not to run for a third term, he handpicked Taft. Taft and Pinchot had a falling out, and Pinchot was fired by Taft. And Pinchot had a falling out with Taft because Taft was eager to give away land and coal mining rights in Alaska.
Ballinger. The mayor of Seattle had arranged it.
Right. Yes. And it was, and he had a bunch of rich buddies who wanted to.
So Gifford Pinchot was fired. That's when he went off and said, well, heck with this, I'll go be governor of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, he became governor of Pennsylvania.
He campaigned for Theodore Roosevelt, who ran for a third term in 1912, which gave Congress to the Democrats, which brought in Woodrow Wilson, who said, Hetch, Hetchy, you bet, put it in. At that time, Democrats were not progressives at all.
Nope.
Environmentalism, Democrats didn't really
mix that
much. In fact, Democrats were the urban parties we talked about last week.
Yeah, they were
Um,
very much the urban party. And so people in San Francisco need water. Well, too bad Yosemite.
And I can hear the logic. I can
Sure.
hear the logic, especially at a time then when now people are much more outdoorsy than they were 120 years ago, 115. But I'm never going to Yosemite. Yeah, it's pretty, but I got a calendar. I've seen one redwood. I've seen them all.
Okay, but look at what happened. My answer to much of this is look at what happened in Costa Rica.
Costa Rica.
Costa Rica has
Wasn't expecting that, or I'd have a picture ready.
Yeah, sorry about that. Costa Rica basically turned its country around. It's basically several very large national parks. It's full of the most exotic wildlife in Central America, and they take in visitors by the tens of thousands.
But there's one Costa Rica. I'm not sure the whole world can be Costa Rica. Costa Rica is the center for ecotourism, much more so than anything else in Central America. And remember, Costa Rica spends, what did they spend on their military every year?
Zero.
Oh, that's right. Costa Rica has no military.
No military.
They're a special case because they're a small country.
Right.
We can't be a small country.
No.
And the other thing is, do we need wood? Are we prepared to live in a society without timber? We probably could, and in fact, if it got expensive enough, we probably could live in houses made of brick and plastic. We could write on, good paper today is still made out of cotton, not made out of trees.
Yeah, but you're growing cotton. Cotton is
pretty bad on the soil too. But we're doing it on the places that we've already pillaged. Okay.
Yeah.
But the question, how do you convince a society to grow trees that you will never bask in the shade of? The answer has got to be coming back to Muir, its responsibility. And ultimately, we seem to have this every time we have a discussion and a disagreement, we come back with, well, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of good management and it's a little bit of common decency.
Right.
And a little bit of thinking about the future and a better world. And yeah, it's very easy to say. And I'm sure there are plenty of greedy people out there who say, well, I'll never be in the shade of that. But we have not talked much history. We've talked mainly politics tonight. You know that?
Yeah, not much history at all. But
the
history
does start with Pinchot and Muir and this debate. It continues to this day. And it's also the debate between the intellectual arguments of Pinchot, which says this and this is logically better, this is better, and the emotional beauty of Muir. And, they put Muir on the California quarter, not Pinchot.
Not Pinchot, no.
Now, Pinchot probably saved more forests than Muir.
Right, no question.
Because, Pinchot said, if we don't stop this, it's going to be cleaned out. And he's probably right. They probably would have clear cut all the way to Washington State.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we still have this balance. And the public, the answer to this question, how do you, convince a society to grow trees they'll never bask in the shade in? The answer is through poetic visual imageries, through a sense of responsibility.
Or by appealing to their greed.
You mean I can borrow money against something I will never have?
Yeah.
I deposit a few pennies in the bank and it'll turn into millions of dollars.
Compound interest,
yes.
or just make it valuable to people who really can use it.
So you have to care. This is interesting. Not where I expected this discussion to go, because ultimately you can only regulate so much.
Right.
You do have to care. And so it does take a balance of, and the other thing about Muir versus Pinchot, Pinchot, as I said, saved a lot more trees than Muir ever did. Pinchot, Muir captured the public, Pinchot captured the government interest. Pinchot had more effect. Muir is more fun to read.
Oh, yeah.
Muir, and by the way, for anybody out there, I recommend you can go onto Internet Archive. You can download his books for free. They're beautiful. They're inspiring. This is a college dropout who understood beauty and conveyed it very well. He once met with Ralph Waldo Emerson, brought him out to Yosemite. They had a fun visit. He basically apparently was like a camp follower to Emerson, just adored him and his work.
So definitely, it took both voices. And of course, Theodore Roosevelt pushing all of this through. But of course, it's politics. It didn't last. It went away very quickly. There were other things that
there was a war
captured
came
everybody.
along. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. We have a show coming up that we're planning on doing about the promise of the future of the New York World's Fair, which led into Something happened right after 1939 that just messed up this dream of a perfect future. So the practical realities, you know, when you're saying, let's preserve all this area, and they're saying, we've got to go fight a war, we need all of your foresters to go get in a uniform and go fight the Huns.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
it gets put on hold.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's it. I think that's pretty much what I
What we
wanted
have
to
to say.
for this week. We'll get into
So
a
we're
little
talking
bit
about
more
coming back next
detail.
week and talking about more of the fun of forestry, and what it can do, what forests can do for you. Let me just fill some time for a second, would you please?
Oh, you need me to fill some time for a second. So we're going to be taking on some various topics about forestry, how it's done, and why it needs to be done.
All right. And for the record, here's just a little teaser that we put together involving next week.
Mhm.
Oops, that's not it. I have done that every time.
At least once.
Oh my God, it's true.
Yep.
Okay, so I think that's going to do it for tonight. We'd like
Yep.
to thank everybody for viewing and invite you to post comments, give us suggestions, tips, even tell us to shut up because you're saying stupidly obvious things. So we'd love to hear from you.
Anyway.
We plan on being back next week with more exciting History Unsettled.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night. Let me find my closing picture. Oops, that's not it.
That's fine.
Your mic is still open.
Shh.